Valentina Izmirlieva, and I have the great pleasure as the director of the Harriman Institute to welcome you all to an event with Louisa Slavkova, the leader of Sofia platform. We are mounting this event at a very remarkable moment when we celebrate events in the recent history in Eastern Europe, the 35th anniversary of some really tectonic shifts in our political culture that marked the end of the communist era. On Saturday, we commemorated the 35th anniversary of the beginning of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and only yesterday, the fall of the long-term Bulgarian communist government of Todor Zhivkov. So it is wonderful to be able to mark these events in the company and in conversation with Louisa, whose work I admire very much. I am sure that most of you are familiar with her work and the work of Sofia platform, but I will just say a few words. Sofia platform was founded more than 10 years ago as an NGO whose mission is focused on fostering both education and public dialogue about the communist past, the historical legacy of our most recent history, and the cultivation of political culture as our desired horizon. Louisa Slavkova is a political scientist and author with extensive expertise on foreign policy, democracy development, and civic education. Apart from having created and led Sofia platform, she most recently co-founded the Civics Innovation Hub, a pan-European nonprofit organization, which in a way magnifies the kind of work she has done in Sofia platform on a larger European setting. And she now serves as one of the 3 managing partners by overseeing operations in Bulgaria. She has held various positions in academic institutions, including at Columbia University, where she was a visiting fellow several years ago. We are very happy to have her back among us, however, virtually. We have chosen as the lens of our conversation today Sofia platform's recent project, Histories from Belene, which they started in 2022 and most recently had a fantastic exhibit here in the US, in DC. So we're using this project in order to launch a larger conversation about the significance of both personal and collective memories about the communist past and the writing and rewriting of history when it comes to such a heavily contested part of our shared experiences. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Louisa, but just a few words about the format of this webinar. We have audiences simultaneously on Zoom and on YouTube, and all of you are welcome to post questions to Louisa in the Q&A section. We have budgeted about 1 hour and 10 minutes for the event, with a short presentation by Louisa in the beginning and then an open conversation among all of us. Louisa, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me again, and thank you for this beautiful opportunity and for your generous introduction. Just to help us through the conversation, I will share a PowerPoint presentation. I know we don't love them all, but it's, just a visual aid while we try to structure our thoughts around the 35th anniversary since the fall of the Berlin Wall and end of communism, as I said, in Bulgaria, but also what is the role that memory remembrance plays in it. And as you said, the reason for this conversation is a recent event that the Sofia platform did with the support of the America for Bulgaria Foundation in Washington, D.C. And this was an exhibition, an interactive exhibition that had the same title, Belene, a Bulgarian Resistance Story. So I will show you a little bit about the exhibition itself, what it was all about, and what it was based on, because it's based on a digital repository of recordings of 9 survivors of the largest Bulgarian camp. And I'll try to explain why they are so important, even though they're only 9, and how I place them in the larger context of what Germans would call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, so dealing or reconciling with the recent past. And we'll kind of come to where we are now, 35 years later, thinking about these events. Now, this is the poster of the exhibition, and you see in the middle a little booth or a kiosk, which actually was not that little. And on the outside, on the curtains, you see pictures from the beautiful island of Belene, where the largest camp during communism was placed. And when you'd enter the booth, you would have 2 chairs, and you can sit down as a visitor to this experience, close the curtains, and on the inside, you see another picture of the island, but then in the winter with snow, with barbed wire. And when you sit down on the chair in front of you, there is a huge screen where you see this gentleman. You see a recording of this gentleman, which is who is one of the survivors that we have interviewed over the past 3 years, asking him more than 600 questions. And so what we did in the exhibition is to basically enable, through AI, a lifelike conversation with a survivor of the camp. We have been able to subtitle the recordings in English, and so that made it possible also for an English speaking audience. We had close to 500 visitors in those 3 days of the exhibition, which is something we're really very proud of. And as I said, this booth is simulating a private conversation with the survivor. There were quite a few emotional reactions to the exhibition. There were visitors who were Ukrainian by background, who were coming to the exhibition, and obviously this is placing these historical accounts in a very different context for them, but also visitors who were, let's say, American Cuban or American Vietnamese, who have had experience with a left-wing dictatorship in their countries of origin. It has been also very interesting to see how different also partisan reactions in a way have been. I mean, I'm not sure how Americans vote, or I can't, this is an assumption, but it's been interesting to see how different the ways have been to which they react, but both groups with a lot of curiosity, which gives me a hint of how important actually conversations about what communism is and what communism is not are also for America and in the American context. I showed you here a glimpse and a couple of pictures of where the exhibition took place, and this was Nikola's picture. Now, I mentioned that we recorded interviews with Nikola and another 8, so in total 9 survivors of the biggest communist camp in Bulgaria. I'm very sad to say that 3 of the 6 ones you see on these little pictures are not anymore amongst us, which makes the work that we did with them and recording them particularly valuable. Now, these were oral history interviews, and I know that Columbia University has a very strong tradition in oral history, which is not necessarily the case in my home country in Bulgaria. The recording of these survivors is particularly valuable for these countries for many reasons, but 2 of them are that 40% of the state security archives have been destroyed, so that their testaments, their messages have also a great historical value. And the second reason is that the voice of the survivors is not necessarily heard and very prominent in the public space. I'll come to talk about why that is, beyond obviously the fact that when you're traumatized, which they all have been, you don't necessarily talk about what happened to you, publicly. Now, what we did with the recordings is to place them in a sort of a digital repository, the Belene.camp website, and it houses more than 180 hours of footage. And using AI, you can sit in front of any device and have an AI-aided conversation with the recordings. This means AI is not making up content, but what it does is it works like a big Google for the survivors' recordings. It searches for the most suitable videos that match the keywords of your question. On that same webpage, one can also access a digital tour of Belene with short videos that give some background to the different sites of the camp, and you can also book a tour of the camp. Now, apart from the importance of recording the survivors' voices because of the demolished archives and the lack of awareness about their stories and communism in general in the country, this has been also our way to fill the gap of a non-existing site of memory on the former site of the camp. To date, where the camp used to be, there is a functioning criminal prison, and there is no freely and easily accessible site where one could go put a flower or learn something really about communism and the history of the camp. So by not being able to make a proper site of memory, we went digital and we built this digital space. This is why also this kind of digital/video tour of Belene is so important. I will try now to demonstrate the Belene Camp website, and I hope all goes well. You know how this is with technology. So I will stop sharing this for a moment and share the website. Now, what you see here is what is visible on the Belene.camp site when you go under tour. And you see here little dots that show you on this larger green spot the different sites of the former camp. For example, this is number 3 is where site number 1 of the camp used to be. This is where site number 2 of the camp used to be. This is another little island off the shores of the Danube River, where the women's camp was located. This here is a little island where the mass graves have been where bodies have been buried of people murdered in the camp, and so on and so forth. And I'll just play a very short video so you see what is it that we are trying to show to visitors who are not able to to try and go and visit the site, but decide to visit the website. You have a little information here about that specific site. And then you click here.
Всички бехме без присъди. На остров Штурчето. Малък остров, необитаем до тогава. Анархистите си знаехме какво ни очаква. Ще ни преследват, знаехме, че ще има изтезане, знаехме, че ще попълпат подло. Всички тия неща ги знаехме и ги очаквахме. Първият път, като ме задържаха, започнах да се поплакам. Първо за съпруга си, после за майка ми. Спомням си това и си плачех. Имаше форма на наказание, а не на превъзпитание. Ще мислиш и ще говориш така, както партията нареди. Престора ти зависи от тебе. Никога не ни каза за колко време си отишъл там. Нямахме връзка с моите близки. Те също не знаеха нищо за нас. Нямахме право да пишеме писма, нямахме право да получаваме колети. Не разсъждавахме, просто се бехме свикнали в това, че след като са ни наложили такъв режим, единственото нещо, което ни чака е само смъртта. Друго нищо не ни чака, освен смърт. Ние си носехме клемета от враг на народа и това се отразяваше не само върху нас, а и върху родителите. Спомням си, на майка ми не й даваха хлеб да получава. Партията беше над държавата. Тази система, която само с терора и жестокост е служила през целието ти съществуване. И когато стигнах до момента, в който реших, че най-страшното е да умра, се почувствам по-своему свободна.
This was Sutana, who is unfortunately not anymore amongst us, and she was the last female survivor of the camp. I mentioned a couple of times that access is difficult to the former sites of the camp because there is a functioning prison. So if you look at the lower left corner of this map and you see the town of Belene there, you see here a white line that is basically the crossing of the Danube River with a bridge. But this is also where you enter the actual functioning prison. So you need an extra access documents to be able to enter. This is why it's also very important to find a local guide, which you can easily do on this website, which also educators do a lot these days. And then you drive down this white line until you get to this point where you see the two lakes. And this is where the best preserved part of the campus. Today, what you can find there is a couple of old buildings from the 50s, so you do not find anymore the barracks that were built in the very beginning. The camp was built or opened in 1949, and in the very beginning, it had really little barracks that were built by the interned citizens themselves. The camp was not only the biggest, but also the one that operated the longest. It finally closed in 87, and it worked in four different phases. And something like 15,000 people passed through it. But at some point, the party, and this was especially the case after the death of Stalin, the party started mixing the camp, the people who were interned with criminals. So at some point, it is very difficult to be able to say who got there why. But those who got there for political reasons, those 15,000 people that we could detect through the archives, they were put there without any sentence and trial. This means they never really knew the real reason for being interned, and they also never knew when are they going to be allowed to go. What the party oftentimes did is when they were letting them leave the camp, they would force them to sign becoming an informant, which is such a horrible thing to do with someone who has suffered through being in the camp already for sometimes couple of years. And then you had to become an informant because otherwise you would be sent back to the camp, which is also one of the reasons why so many of them didn't dare speaking about their times in the camps after 89, because there was also that stigma of many people would even still to date say, oh, how could you, others, not all of them agreed to become informants. How could you, or why did you become an informant? And in the preparatory conversation to tonight, Valentina and I were talking about that it's very difficult to be judging people from today's point of view when it comes to who agreed to become an informant under these circumstances and not. Now, this is where the first 6 survivors' recordings have been uploaded, and I'll try to demonstrate how the conversations go with Nikola Daskalov, who was featured in the exhibition in Washington, D.C. Now you see that there is an elderly gentleman to the left who is moving a little bit and blinking. There is a little instruction here that shows you how to have that conversation with the survivor. And here, when you press the microphone, this is actually where you can ask your question. I'll try with a question or two just so you get the gist of it, and I'll leave it to you to experiment whenever you have time. I should also mention that the more the platform is used, the better it gets, because this is what AI does. It becomes smarter over time. What is your name?
Името ми е Никола Димитров Даскалов.
How old are you?
След един месец ще стана на 88.
How old were you when you were persecuted? Let me try again. How old were you when you were persecuted?
– 82-3 месеца.
Why were you sent to the camp?
Често пъти съм си задавал сам на себе си този въпрос. От една страна, може би, съм си го просил сам. От друга страна, може би че съм бил чисто и просто за попълване на бройката да се изпълни съответното управление на държавна сигурност плана. Тези лагери далече не беха създадени, за да водят истинска реална борба с активни врагове на режима. Техната цел беше съвършено друга. По косвен път да се влияе на останалата част от населението. Не можеш да вкараш цялото население в лагер и да го научиш на послушание, да го възпиташ, тъй като лагерите се наричаха трудово-възпитателни общежития. Много елегантно, нали? Добре звучи. Едно общежитие, в което малко се трудиш и се възпитаваш. Ти си иначе невъзпитан човек. Но, може би, малко съм и подпомогнал хората. Вероятно съм бил взет на намерник поне половин година, ако не е малко повече, когато ми изпратиха един провокатор да ми предложи участие в конспирация и прибързано да почне да ми обяснява какви задачи ще ми се възлагат и да ми възлага предварителни задачи, преди още да съм дал съгласие за участие в конспирация.
I will stop the answer here because it's a lengthy one, but this is also quite typical for survivors or for eyewitnesses, and I think those of you who have experience working with oral history know that. It was really just meant to give you an idea about how that goes. I will go back to my final couple of slides and will then open for a conversation. But feel free to be asking questions in the chat if as they come. What we are currently doing with these recordings, obviously apart from having them on the website and as a offer to educators, we are also trying to build little exhibitions within the remaining buildings of the campsite so that when one goes and visits, apart from the narrative that they hear from the guide, they also have objects to engage with and additional context. Because you can imagine your expectation when you visit a camp like this is to find a place similar to, you name it, Bautzen, Auschwitz, and the campsites, the places of memory that we know from around the world. When you come to Belene, what you see is these empty old buildings with no context. So we try to use that to create context there. I forgot to mention that this digital repository of survivors' testimonies is the only such project that exists for survivors of the communist camps. There is a large project that you might be familiar with in the United States by the USC Shoah Foundation that has been recording survivors of the Holocaust for years. But this is really the first similar attempt to capture the stories and the message of survivors of a communist regime. Belene, I mentioned already, has been the largest and the longest operating camp in Bulgaria. Of these 15,000 prisoners, half of them were ordinary agrarians who just didn't want to give up the piece of land that they owned to the collectivization efforts. On the left side here, you see a map that was produced by the opposition in the early 90s, where they tried to portray with these skeletons of where the different camps were located in the country. These were signs for both camps and prisons in which people were put for political purposes. Now, the broader context against which we place a project like that. In this country, and I think it's very important to keep repeating this, compared to other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, there was no lustration. This means the ones who were responsible for the wrongdoings, for the crimes during communism, were neither persecuted after 89, nor were they prevented from occupying different positions within the state. we have a number of prominent example in the country of former presidents and the likes who have had a state security file and have been working with the state security, and this has not prevented them from becoming politicians. Because of the lack of lustration, and also because of the lack of a prominent institutional and political commitment to dealing with the past, like investing in research or investing in civil society work on education, there are still to date widely spread myths about communism, and I've highlighted here even before historical disinformation. So even before attempts by actors like Russia to play on sentiments related to the good old days, there have been persistent myths about communism. I give this example with my mother, who was living in a little town in this country, keeps telling me that she never really knew anything about Belene pre-89. And I do believe that there have been other citizens in this country who never knew. But so in the lack of a broader conversation about this post-89, there is a still big portion of society that lives with the idea of how communism was actually not that bad. They also put it in a comparison to the 90s, which were really a tough time for everyone here. Mainly, I think also because people were having different expectations. They were expecting that everything would turn great overnight, and this obviously was not the case. We, again, because of the lack of this institutional investment and political will, we for many years haven't really been teaching communism properly at school. And what we then see is young people hearing the stories from their grandparents and developing what we call a secondhand nostalgia for a time that they have never really lived through. I have put a highlight also on 2018. This is only then when communism started being taught in schools, and then in the 10th grade. And I've just putting it here, and we can come to talk about this in the discussion. Not dealing with the communist past has a direct connection to how Bulgaria relates to Russia. Russia obviously is like the sacred cow in Bulgarian history. The role it has played during the liberation from the Ottoman Empire, and the role it has played during communism. None of this has ever been properly institutionally questioned, revised, or researched, which makes Bulgaria a very fertile ground for historical disinformation. And finally, just to mention that the work of Sofia platform, but also other civil society organizations, and I highlight civil society organizations, come in this context and tries to fill this void in research, in education, but also in arts and culture, commemoration, and generally efforts to remember the past. The Valentina started with us marking the 9th and the 10th of November 1989. It has been 35 years ago. Now, I have been following, obviously, the debates in this country over the last couple of days and weeks and months leading to November the 10th. And there is a growing sentiment amongst Bulgarians that 89 was just really given to this society, and there was no real opposition that the Communist Party staged at all, which is a dangerous sentiment, as it reinforces the sense of being powerless as society. I think the fact that this history about communism remains widely unpopular and untold basically leads to these misconceptions and lack of understanding about what communism and what a totalitarian regime actually is, and allows people to make these false comparisons in a way where they are ready to say that communism was better than democracy today. We're marking November the 10th against a different background globally this year. There are wars close to our borders, and there is this lingering sense of that the values and the aspirations of 1989 and this global order based on liberal values is not that stable, and we had never had a end of history moment. There is Russia's ongoing attempt to influence Bulgarian politics and public life. And it's obviously also in their interests to question the events of '89 because they perceive themselves as the great losers of the end of the Cold War. And so we're in a situation where the legacy of 1989 is put in question, which is also deeply connected or strongly connected to the question of our identity as Bulgarians. Who are we? What did '89 really bring to this country? Did it bring freedom, or did it bring something else? And so amidst this context, and I'm sorry, really, I'm doing a wide brush picture here, but it's against this background that the work of our organization, but also of others, should be placed when we speak about what is the importance of sites of memory like Belene that are not freely accessible. What is the importance of such digital projects that have so far allowed really, I think, a little over 100,000 people to visit it and to have these conversations. So it is this background that helps us make sense of November the 10th this year.
Louisa, thank you so much for this rich presentation. I just to open the conversation, you hinted in your last remarks that there is a prevalence of the narrative that there was no real opposition against the communist regime in Bulgaria, which is extremely dangerous because it reinforces passivity and denies Bulgarian people as a whole of political agency. How do you think your project was most successful in battling that narrative? And more broadly, how do you see, where have you been most successful in this project in promoting, as you yourself claim, and as the organization claims on your website, promoting Bulgarian Vergangenheitsbewältigung of sorts?
So I'll start backwards. I think we're mostly successful where we anyways are strongest in focusing on, and this is work with teachers. Since we launched the Belene.camp project, we have been able to bring hundreds of teachers to Belene, organizing teacher trainings on site, by which we were able to show that the road to Belene is long and bumpy, but it's not impossible. We have showed how you can do an actual visit of the camp. We have demonstrated how you can work with the testimonies of the survivors. And we have enabled an intimate conversation amongst the teachers where you always have a few who are nostalgic about the past, and you always have a few who have a personal story related to the camps. And I think this is the most valuable, because a society that has had so many taboos and has so many taboos and doesn't really have a solid culture of public discussion, this is a space where we have we have given the opportunity to teachers of these both backgrounds to actually talk about their own experience of history. But we have also used the opportunity to say, it is very legitimate to have your own personal experience, but this is what history tells us based on the archives, based on the facts, and based on the testimonies of those survivors. Now, even if we've had the greatest of time during communism, sometimes because we were then young and innocent, this doesn't change the nature of the regime, which is also an important skill for teachers themselves, because they have to be able at any time to have this double hat. On the one hand, to have their own personal opinion and story and background, but to be able to take a step back and allow for that fact-based history to be in the center of it. Then how do we, how do we see a project like that contribute to showing Bulgarians that they do have a voice? I think there aren't really, beyond the revival as a historical period and the heroes that we have in Bulgarian history from the revival period, there aren't really that many heroic stories in the public discourse. And we have been trying to show that these are ordinary heroes. These have been people who have been able to do the right thing without necessarily seeking any publicity for that after 89, without going into politics. They have just been trying to do the right thing, and they have been sharing their own survival strategies with sometimes with kids, because we do a lot of youth activities with survivors. And so when you hear the stories about how you deal with life in difficult circumstances like these, I think this is pretty powerful. So I think showing that there are ordinary heroes, that you too can be an ordinary hero, and that there are sources of inspiration and personal examples of so many people in this country, because they're not one, they're not two, but there are really hundreds of thousands who have been intimidated by the regime. And also, they're not all of them just placed in Sofia, but they're spread across the country, because that too is very important. Having this local relationship to someone who comes from your little town, who has had the courage. And, this is how also these ordinary heroes become very relatable, because this is potentially the granny next door.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that the very notion of resistance needs to be opened up and complicated and made more nuanced. Resistance is not just taking arms against a regime. There are forms of everyday resistance and of creative nonviolent resistance. And as far as I understand, your project gives relatable examples specifically of that kind of quiet struggle that makes the big struggle possible, or contributes little steps toward a bigger goal. And the question that you raise is about the lack of like a hero vacuum, if you will, deficit of heroic models in the more recent Bulgarian history, is something that I have also thought about, and how it is the role of educators, both teachers, but also educators, civic educators like your organization, to provide especially young Bulgarians with models of this kind that are inspirational and aspirational moving forward. Can you tell us a little bit more about the reception of this project in the Bulgarian context? Have you gotten a lot of pushback? Have you cultivated champions and followers, and how do you see the future of this project?
There is always the real world and the digital world, and I think there is a big difference. On social media, we get a lot of harassments for what we do, but that's fine. We can deal with that. I think it has been incredible to see how many people started getting in touch with us, wanting to share their stories. This is overwhelming because we would like to find a way to collect all these stories. Sometimes it's stories of the second generation of the children of people who were interned in Belene and in other camps, which is just another example of the need to have this public conversation. I know from research that trauma is stored in a place in our brains where language has no access to. And so a lot of the silence related to trauma, especially in the first decade or two, is, I think, understandable. But now there is a different generation out there that asks different questions. We're all reminded of 1968 in Germany specifically, how another generation is there and starts asking the parents, where were you and what did you do? And so I think this is happening in this country with a little delay, because the children of the ones who were interned also didn't ask or didn't dare asking questions, because they grew up with this silence already in communism. So I think the project's greatest added value outside of really the work with teachers and with young people in schools is the opportunity to start having this conversation, regardless of the forms and the ways it takes place. I should have also mentioned that this year, the Bulgarian project at the Venice Biennale was also devoted to victims of the Belene and the Lovech camp. The Lovech camp is considered to be an extension of the Belene camp, because it was when it was closed the first time after Stalin's death. So I see it as an opportunity to have this conversation. And if 10 years ago, when we started our work, Belene was almost lost and forgotten. People had even stopped going to the commemorative trips once a year, the survivors, because they're getting old, and many of them are not anymore amongst us. But when I look at what has happened over those 10 years, I feel like even with different opinions, we can have this conversation now. And I like a lot to look at it as a story of resistance, because many the reason why so many people know about the history of communism of Czechoslovakia, of Eastern Germany, of Hungary, of Poland, it's because of the resistance movements. Everyone knows about the Prague Spring, everyone knows of Hungary 56, but there is no such moment in Bulgarian history. And I think the camps are a testament of the resistance, because the people who could have potentially done the 68 and the 56, they all ended in the camps. And as Nikola, the survivor, shares in the interviews, he says the purpose of creating these places, because you could not put the whole nation in it. I think that's what he said in the last answer we asked him. You cannot put everyone there. Belene becomes this powerful metaphor for people to know that if you do not behave, that's where you're going to be sent to. And so the last thing you would want to think about is dissent and resistance, organized resistance movement. There was an organized resistance movement in Bulgaria, which was crushed down, and it existed for around 10 years in the late 40s and the early 50s, but it was crushed down.
And another thing that we should keep in mind, that in Bulgaria, immediately after the coming of the Soviet army, there was a wave of disappearing people, the largest per capita in the Eastern Bloc, which also preventively cleansed the population of any potential resistors to the new regime. So for a very small country with a small post-war population, these two mechanisms were very powerful in putting stop to organized resistance, which doesn't mean that other forms of resistance did not exist and they didn't have its place. I have tons of other questions, more philosophical also and more conceptual, but I want to give voice to our audiences. Emily Beasley posted a question which I will read directly from the Q&A. Is there a network of individuals and institutions who share approaches to capturing the voices of those who have been or persecuted, a way in which to learn about the collection of oral histories from various times, past, present, in history, yet share a root history of unjust persecution of a people or of an end, Belene, informants? Do you, as researchers, in other words, gather together? Thank you for this question, Emily. And
it's a great question. I had put on one of the slides that also the research work happening on communism is entirely in the civil society. This means the state here does not support any research focused on communist history. Oral history interviews are collected either by one particular institute. This is the Institute for the Study of the Recent Past, which has been housed by the New Bulgarian University only as of last year. So for the past 20 years, it existed as a civil society organization. They have a collection of oral history interviews with survivors of the regime. And a Bulgarian-Canadian researcher who is one of the authors behind the Bulgarian Venice project this year, which is called The Neighbors. So there are these two, and our digital repository at this moment, we're desperately hoping that researchers, because we're practitioners in our organization, we use this for educational purposes, but we're very much hoping that researchers are going to be interested in working with these stories. And this is also one of the reasons why we have embarked on translating some of them in English, so that maybe also researchers who work with English would be curious to see what they can make, what they can make out of these testimonies.
Great. And Emily has an additional question. What do you think explains the shift in opening to dialogues in the past 10 years? Any thoughts on that?
I think this has been really the change of generations in this country. There's a young generation that has oftentimes, or some of them have lived abroad, studied abroad. They have seen other ways of dealing with the past. They're coming back and they start asking questions in a very, they're free from the burden of a personal experience or whatsoever. And I think this has been happening, especially in the arts and culture realm. There are young artists who are doing interesting projects, doing public installations, doing even public provocations on particular anniversaries. And I think this is helping also change the discourse. Yesterday on November the 10th, we had the current mayor of Sofia write on his social media that he's willing to support the creation of a communist history museum, because Sofia is the last capital that does not have one in this part of the world. So, and he too belongs to a generation, to a younger generation. So I'm thinking there is something about that. And I'm just hoping that with the little work that organizations like ours, but also the researchers have done, is enough for those institutions to be able to step on in terms of what's been amounted over the last 35 years.
Thank you. This dovetails with a question by Yulia Vasilyeva. I will condense it, but the gist of the question, because it's very long, is how do you see the possibility for an educational shift with respect to the communist past. Are there any processes in this direction, any indications that educational programs will change to?
Well, so communism was not taught in schools until 2018. So it started being taught only as of then. And we're doing every 8 years, or have done so far, twice, a poll amongst young people just to see how much they know about communism, but also how that translates into understanding the world, basically applying the knowledge or making value judgments about the past and the present, or about totalitarian regimes and democracy. And the number of young people who know more about communism is definitely on the rise. At the same time, the value judgment does not change, which means they're collecting facts, but they're not certain about making a judgment about what communism really was. I am thinking for that, much more time has to pass. And this is why I also see the work with teachers as one of the most valuable things to do, to really support them in teaching rather than try to do other things. So the teaching environment has been challenged in a totally new way as of this summer. In Bulgaria, there is a far-right party that has been trying to intimidate civil society for quite some time. You know, the foreign agents legislation from countries like Russia, but also Georgia, more recently, Hungary and Poland, Slovakia with recent attempts as well. And that party has been continuously saying that people like us belong back into a place like Belene. And if they were in power, they would reopen a place like that. They have been able in the summer to change the education law in Bulgaria to prohibit what they call an LGBTQI propaganda. Now, the law prohibits any type of propaganda in schools per se, so there is no need to explicitly mention any type of whatever that would mean as in propaganda. But so what are the odds that they decide to modify the law by saying that they prohibit an anti-communist or whatever they decide to call it propaganda? Their party has filed a complaint to the prosecutor general a couple of years ago, in which organizations like ours were included because in their opinion, we're not doing good work in schools, and we do not belong in schools. So this is just to give you a little bit of a broader context that the challenge is not necessarily dealing with maybe a little more traditional ways of teaching in a didactical way when it comes to the teachers, or having their own challenges in teaching a history which they lived through parts of their life and have their personal experience. But there is this additional challenge of the general environment, political environment in a country where, with the current levels of political instability, that far-right party was very close to coming second in the last parliamentary elections.
Yeah, the question of writing and rewriting history, who has the power to write history, and what are the strategies of manipulating personal memory and collective memory, both fragile entities, in order to eliminate uncountable pasts and create usable ones. Russia leads the way in this direction with the almost complete suppression of the Memorial project and incarceration of all the leaders, and persecution on a large scale of any kind of commemoration of the victims of the communist past. So it's very dangerous that we are beginning to see elements of that in Bulgaria as well. There is a question by Jenny Radin. You mentioned your mother was remembering the past differently. Can you expand on that? And it's a good way to discuss more broadly the value of the witness and the vulnerabilities of personal memory when it comes to the historical narrative of a nation.
I have to say, my mom is probably a much more open-minded person than I am, which is incredible for someone who is in her early 70s. I think much of her attitudes about the communist past come from the fact that she, just like so many people in this country, never really read books about the camps. The research that is existing has never really become widely accessible. We haven't really had the a TV series that would focus on that period. We don't have the educational institutions. We haven't really had, on an institutional level, we haven't done what people would call dealing with the past. It has certain segments that would have to happen. You would change the names of streets, you would remove monuments, you would have public discussions about all of that. You would have, school curricula as of the early days. You would have institutes who've researched. They would not be necessarily only focused in the capital, but it would be spread across the country. You would do tons of work both in the formal and in the non-formal sector. And because this has not happened, I think she is confronting this history only now that she sees that I'm so invested in it. And we had a funny conversation yesterday about Belene again, and she was saying, you know what, the pensioners club manager in my little town would never encourage an excursion to Belene. They go everywhere across the country because of her background, so she was connected to the Communist Party pre 89. And the more she's reading, the more she's like really, viscerally getting angry and not understanding why, on the one hand, so many people suffered through the camps, and on the other hand, no one was ever persecuted about these wrongdoing, because these are broken lives forever. Nikola Daskalov, one of the survivors, has this very strong sentence, message where he says, no one's ever the same person when they leave the camp, regardless of how long they stayed there. And so I think that the difference in understanding, at least in her case, is not because she's not open-minded and she's not willing to learn, but it's just because she's never really had the access. In the little town where she lives, I'm just giving 3 examples. 2 of the large boulevards are called, one of them is called Moscow to date, and the other one is called September the 9th. This is the date on which the Soviet army occupied Bulgaria, because many people forget Bulgaria was on the side of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. But in the public discourse, it's widely remembered as Russia came to rescue us from the Second World War. Yeah. And so the other example is just that one poet who was not particularly talented, for the sake of his career, joined the one of the People's Court's committees. And he's celebrated in the town as a big hero. The People's Court was that court of which you, Valentina, spoke a moment ago, that brought this mass murder of political of people who belonged to the regime pre-communism. People's Court who sentenced to death over 2,000 people who were killed around February the 1st in 45. So that one writer was part of one of the committees of this People's Court, and that person is still celebrated as a hero in this little town. So these 3 examples, just as a why for someone like her, that history is just still widely inaccessible.
Joe Siegel has a question. he starts with a thank you for fascination connecting past and present. Are you aware of the Albanian Human Rights Project, which documents 100+ historical witness interviews with former political prisoners in communist Albania? This might make an interesting comparison. That project has been supported by the Shoah Foundation. The interviews are kept at the University of Southern California and the Wendy Museum of Los Angeles.
I was not aware of that, so thank you very much for bringing it up. I've just copied your message. I'm only familiar with the work of Junila Godole. I'm not sure if you know her, but she's devoted to teaching communism in Albania. So I will look them up. Thank you for that.
And since we're approaching the end of our allotted time, I just want to thank, first of all, our audience, which came from all over the place, participated actively, and of course, to have a shout out to Louisa, who presented fascinating material and raised very important questions for our time, not just for Bulgaria, but globally. Thank you so much. Thank you all. And I hope to see you at another Harriman event soon. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Valentina. Thank you to the Harriman Institute for hosting this conversation tonight. It's a privilege. Thank you.